we'll let people in as we start. So welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us, for taking time out of your day, out of your evening, good morning, wherever you are, perhaps good evening, good afternoon, because we are an international audience. My name is Mdu Ntuli, and I'm part of the education team from the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, which is part of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation. And this special webinar is in partnership with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and the Center for Humanistic Education, which is part of the Ghetto Fighters House Museum in Israel. And this is in honor of Refugee Day, International Refugee Day. And we are honored to be joined by 3 survivors from the St. Louis, from the MS St. Louis from 1939. We have Sonja Geismar, we have Eva Wiener, and we have Thomas Jacobson, who will be part of a panel discussion that will be coordinated by Robert Krakow. So at this point in time, I would like to introduce Mr. Leonard Zulu, and he's going to share with us a message to begin this webinar officially. So I'm going to play a video from Mr. Leonard Zulu, who's going to share his message with us.
You can't hear.
Yes.
Will
So
you
Danny,
restart?
can you?
World Refugee. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel discussion to World Refugee Day. And the backdrop of the story of the refugees of the MS St. Louis really epitomizes what happens when international protection is not provided to people who are fleeing persecution. That tragedy today on World Refugee Day brings into sharp focus the need for the international community to adopt a multilateral approach to the protection of refugees, especially asylum-seeking refugees. I am the representative of UNHCR in South Africa. The office was established in 1993 in South Africa here, in the run-up to the dismantling of the apartheid regime in 1994. And we were entrusted with supporting the return of South African refugees back home. UNHCR is the oldest human rights organization in the United Nations. It was provided the mandate, it was entrusted with the mandate on December 14, 1950, during the aftermath of the Second World War, to help millions of refugees who had fled or lost their homes, mainly European refugees. The Refugee Convention, which has its 70th anniversary next month, was born of the collective intention never again to allow people forced to flee to be denied sanctuary. 70 years later, we are still protecting people forced to flee. During our lifetime, we have helped well over 50 million refugees to successfully restart their lives, to seek international protection in other countries, and to be part of the societies in the host communities where they are living. This is, of course, not a moment of celebration, but really calls upon us to deeply reflect on the tragic circumstances that lead refugees to flee their places of origin or habitual residence. In the last decade alone, global displacement has doubled. It is a time to redouble our efforts also to protect these refugees. We are proud of our work as UNHCR and feel privileged to serve the refugees, the internally displaced, and the stateless. together with our partners, especially those who provide voluntary funds in order for UNHCR to discharge its mandate. The 70th anniversary of the Refugee Convention is a reminder to the world to tackle the root causes of displacement. Only concerted international action and political will can resolve new and protracted conflicts and crises. Good governance, the rule of law, is at the heart of ensuring that or preventing people from fleeing their countries. World leaders need to do better in promoting peace and stability if they are to end the vicious cycle of violence, suffering, and forced displacement. For 70 years, UNHCR has been helping people forced to flee. The last 70 years of South Africa's history are also closely interwoven with refugee issues. Thousands of South Africans fled the apartheid regime in the latter half of the 20th century, seeking safe haven across the African continent and beyond. More recently, thousands of foreign citizens who have fled conflict and persecution in their own lands have found safety in South Africa. For more than 2 decades now, South Africa has been an excellent and generous host to refugees. The country's progressive legislation has allowed thousands of vulnerable people to establish themselves in the country and rebuild their lives for themselves and their families. The open door policy that South Africa has meant that from the day that an asylum-seeking refugee arrives in the country, they are included. They are included in health, education, and the social fabric of the country. They can access health services, all public services, including education, which is most important. They have all the rights protected under the Constitution, except the right to vote. Therefore, I would like to commend the government and people of South Africa for having this inclusive approach to refugee protection. Inclusion is vital for us all to stay safe and to keep hopeful. From equal access to healthcare to communities working together for the benefit of all, only collective action towards our common goal will get us through these extraordinary and challenging times. This year, World Refugee Day is all about inclusion. The theme is togetherness. Together we heal, learn, and shine. Only together will we heal from this pandemic and build a stronger community. Only when we all act together do we truly meet our aspirations and expectations. It is important also to underline that this is the second year that World Refugee Day in South Africa and the world over is being celebrated in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has brought into sharp focus the inequalities that exist in society. But it has also shown us a bright side to humanity, the spirit of resilience, solidarity that refugees have demonstrated within their own communities, that the host communities, the South Africans, have demonstrated towards refugees towards ordinary South Africans, where there has been a strong spirit of solidarity, where people have come together to help each other. Neighbors have shared food. Neighbors have supported each other from evictions, from helping each other to pay utility bills by putting their resources together, paying rent and paying electricity and water bills. UNHCR has done a small part. The government has done a very large part of this. The Solidarity Fund that was established to support everyone that lives in South Africa to cope with the shocks that the COVID-19 pandemic brought upon our society. COVID has put a strain on healthcare, schools, and our communities. We have all had to do our part to keep each other safe. Despite the challenges, refugees and displaced people have stepped up. Here in South Africa, refugees are our neighbors. They are also our doctors, our fellow students, our sportsmen and women. They are the ordinary person next door to us. They are the person that we stand next to in the queue to get a taxi to go to work. They are the workers that work in our factories, in our restaurants, in our shops and industry. Refugees in South Africa are like you and me, and together we can achieve anything. During COVID-19, we have all done our bit to keep each other safe. Given the chance, refugees will continue to contribute a stronger, safer, and more vibrant world and society. I am very pleased to be here today to talk to you about the ordinary men and women, children, girls and boys out there who are refugees and the aspirations that they have. Importantly, when I go around and talk to refugees, they talk about their hope and expectations to be strong contributors to the development of the communities that they live in. They would like to go to primary school, they would like to go to secondary school, they would like to go to universities and colleges. They would like to find a job. They would like to earn a dignified income. They would like to be part of the community. They would like to be able to educate their children and to be able to support their relatives who are sick. They would like to put food on the table, and they would like to see their children grow into strong citizens of the communities in which they grow. Therefore, I call upon you to include refugees, to adopt the spirit of togetherness, to look out for your neighbor who may be a refugee today, but also look out for your neighbor who today is not a refugee, but tomorrow they can be a refugee. I can be a refugee tomorrow. Any one of us can be refugees tomorrow. So thank you very much, and I wish you all a reflective World Refugee Day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Zulu, for that message and for that warning, actually, that we need to be aware of how we treat one another, because we don't know what the future holds, but we need to be more compassionate and to reach out and try to bridge that gap between one another, especially during this time. And we've seen extraordinary situations where people really have reached out to refugees in different communities, and refugees have also reached out to local communities, and we've seen a kind of togetherness. So thank you very much for reminding us of that. And so now I would like to introduce and present another partner that has made this event possible, and that is Noha Khatib from the Center for Humanistic Education, which is part of the Ghetto Fighters House. The Ghetto Fighters House was actually founded in 1995, and it really has broken new ground in its approach to Holocaust education and in its unique education activities, teaching Holocaust as a historical crisis that invites us to explore social and human dilemmas of a truly universal nature. So the work that they've done, especially during this time of the world, really has been incredible. I've seen some of their activities. I've truly been impressed. And then after that, Tali Nates is going to also be speaking to us. Tali Nates is the founder and the executive director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, but also the chair of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation. And Tali again represents someone who has a passion for Holocaust history, but has made it very, very accessible to many people in South Africa, and is a true exemplary example of someone who exemplifies compassion for others, and has able to bridge that gap between ourselves and others. So it's an honor to have these two speakers. So I'm going to invite Noha to speak to us.
So good evening, everyone. So dear distinguished guests, it's really an honor to me to take part in this important event tonight. As the director of the Center for Humanistic Education at the Ghetto Fighters House Museum, I believe in the importance of educational work that promotes humanistic values and undertake every effort to promote these values as they are essential for our community here in Israel, and as well for all human beings in every part of the world, as part of our bigger humanity society. The mission of our Center of Humanistic Education is to allow and enable many, many different stories and narratives to become part of the society's discourse. The aim is to make every story to be heard, and through that allow the storyteller to begin his inner process of healing, and at the same time the listeners are enabled to learn to connect to what is being told and feel empathy as human beings. The Ghetto Fighters House Museum has, as an educational institution, is highly aware of the importance of the refugee crisis around the world and its complexity for us, especially here in Israel. 1 year ago, the museum hosted an exhibition that dealt with this important topic, and it encouraged many, many meaningful discussions with our group that visited this exhibition, and it was a great opportunity to talk about the value of humanity. Tonight, I'm very, very happy and honored to be part of this very honorable event that invites us all to listen, to discuss, and to deepen our knowledge about such an important story that, alongside to its great sadness, it also shows rays of hope. I wish for us all to experience a meaningful time together, although we are communicating through these screens, but still. And I hope that we will all have the privilege to be, to hear, to present more, and be aware of more stories that haven't been told yet. I hope this event will be only a starting point to many, many more opportunities in which we can meet, exchange stories, and get connect together. Thank you very much for having me tonight, and I'm very looking forward to having this experience together with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Noha, so much. And welcome everyone to this special World Refugee Day event. It's also the anniversary of the tragic return to Antwerp of the St. Louis on this exact day, 82 years ago, on the 17th of June, 1939. And that is why we chose today for this event. Of course, it is really important for me to pay homage to all the dear Holocaust survivors that are joining us today from the United States, from South Africa, and from other parts of the world. It is also an honor to partner with the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency in Pretoria, And thank you to Kate Pond for this connection, and to Representative Leonard Zulu for his very actually said at times words. It is wonderful to also partner with the Center for Humanistic Education at the Ghetto Fighters House. And Medin Shachar, thank you for your partnership and friendship. And Noah Khatib, thank you for your powerful words. It is wonderful to see many of our supporters, our volunteers, Board of Trustees members, directors, and staff of the 3 centers in South Africa, in Cape Town, in Durban, and in Johannesburg. And of course, a special mention of General Diamond, the chairman of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation Board of Trustees. And of course, what an honor to welcome our guest speakers today, the St. Louis survivors, Sonja Geismar, Eva Wiener, and Thomas Jacobson, and film director Robert Krakow. And I'm so happy that many teachers and colleagues, and even people who are seeking refuge today are joining us to this important commemoration event. This year actually marks the 27th year after the end of apartheid and the transition to democracy in South Africa that we all celebrated. However, our painful past does not necessarily mean that South Africans are now immune to racism or to prejudice. And we see that in increasing instances of hate speech, of racism, and sadly, the murderous xenophobic attacks that continued since 2008 until today. The South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation is an association of 3 Holocaust and Genocide centers in Cape Town, Durban, and Johannesburg. And all 3 centers are spaces of memory, of education, and where lessons for humanity are learned from the history of the Holocaust and the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, as well as other instances of genocide in the 20th century. We explore the connections between genocide and contemporary human rights violations in South Africa. And we urge all to understand the consequences of prejudice, of racism, of anti-Semitism, of xenophobia, and of othering. On Human Rights Day, on the 21st of March this year, we, together with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and Jacana Media, published the book Brother by photojournalists Alon Skye and James Otway. The book covers the past 12 years of deadly xenophobic attacks in South Africa against refugees and asylum seekers. In 2021, the violence shows no sign of stopping, even during COVID. The photojournalists have been documenting this issue for 12 years, and they feature many unbelievable photographs in this book, Brother. There are also many essays by leading journalists and thought leaders, with a foreword written by former Constitutional Court Judge, Justice Edwin Cameron, and critical texts by Akile Membe, João Silva, Justice Malala, Koketsu Moeti, and others. And today, on World Refugee Day, I invite you all to reflect on the challenges facing refugees, but also on their resilience and on their great contribution to humanity. To learn more about the book, I invite you to go into the book's website that I am putting now in the chat box. That will allow you to explore some of the themes of refugees in South Africa and sadly xenophobic attacks against them. Awareness to the plight of refugees grew in the 1930s after the Nazis took power in Germany. In South Africa, between 1933 and 1936 and the passing of the Aliens Act, only 3,621 German Jewish refugees managed to safely arrive in the country. And thus, we are looking very much forward to learn more about the story of the refugees of the St. Louis, a key turning point event in refugees' history. The resilience and life experiences of many of the refugees, including those who will speak to us in a few minutes, can teach us about the amazing contribution they bring to any society. This story is also about the international community's duty to be active role players when men, women, and children are in desperate need of a safe haven from persecution. But sadly, on that point, we still have a lot to learn, and I think on the whole, we are failing. It is my honor then to introduce you to the three refugees who were passengers of the St. Louis, Sonja Geismar, Eva Wiener, and Thomas Jacobson, and to the one that will leading the conversation, Mr. Robert Krakow. Sonja Geismar joining us from Bronx, New York. In May 1939, she and her parents and many other members of her family were passengers on the St. Louis. When returned to Europe, they managed to go to England, Sonja and her parents, and then to New York. And she will tell us more about her story. Sonja became a high school social studies teacher, then studied for her master's degree and became a high school librarian in a city school, and after 10 years became the head librarian of that school. Eva Wiener is joining us from Neptune, New Jersey. Eva her childhood name was Safia, and now Wiener was born in Berlin, Germany. Her parents and her were also passengers on the St. Louis. And when the ship was forced to return its passengers to Europe, they were amongst the fortunate ones to find safety in England. They immigrated to the United States after the war, and she was employed and won many awards for her work as a budget analyst at Fort Mammoth, an installation of the US Department of Defense. Lastly, Thomas Jacobson, who is joining us from Los Angeles, California. He's one of the youngest surviving passengers of the SS St. Louis, and he dedicated his 50-year legal career to fight against injustice. He was the forefront of civil rights struggles in the 60s and 70s, leading the first Northern sit-in to enact statewide fair housing legislation. He actually persuaded the Warren US Supreme Court to rule garnishment before judgment unconstitutional, throwing out a decades-old law that was unfair to working people. In 1969, the Milwaukee Sentinel named him Man of the Year for public service on behalf of consumers. Leading the conversation is Mr. Robert Krakow, who is a film producer of the film Complicit, the untold story of why the Roosevelt administration denied safe harbor to Jewish refugees. He is the executive director at SS St. Louis Legacy Project, an educational foundation working through films, theater projects, and exhibitions with universities, museums, communal organizations, and libraries throughout the world. They focus on Holocaust education, immigration and refugee policy, human rights, and political and diplomatic history. Before I hand over to Robert, we will now watch a short film about the St. Louis from a CNN report, and that will be followed by the discussion. Thank you.
The 70th anniversary of an infamous voyage. In 1939, the SS St. Louis, a German ocean liner, sailed to the US, hoping to find homes for German Jewish refugees, but they were denied entry. Surviving passengers reunited in Miami Beach just this week, just miles from where their boat sat decades ago. The beauty of the beaches and the palm trees, that's what Herb Carliner says he remembered the most. In 1939, as a 12-year-old boy, Carliner and his family gazed upon the Florida coast from the luxury liner SS St. Louis. They dreamed it would be their salvation from the Nazi rampage.
We had to leave because there was no future for us in Germany.
But off the coast of Miami Beach, the vessel with 937 people, mainly Jewish refugees, was never permitted to enter the U.S. It was forced to return to Europe, which was on the verge of a world war. 254 of them eventually died during Hitler's Holocaust.
Now, we knew that this was a land of immigrants, founded and formed by people like ourselves seeking freedom and opportunity. But we couldn't understand why all of a sudden the Coast Guard forced us into international waters.
But what happened? Some historians say President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's hands were tied by strict immigration laws and public opinion.
Certainly FDR, I believe, was perhaps remiss in not allowing these folks to disembark in the United States, but he was bound by laws that were not of his own making.
But Herb Carliner believes anti-Semitism was behind it. His parents and two of his sisters who were on board the St. Louis were killed by the Nazis when they returned to Europe. He blames FDR and says a message was sent to Hitler that Jews were expendable.
This ship, St. Louis, was the beginning of the Holocaust because it shows you that nobody wants the Jews, so they can do with them whatever they want to do.
The St. Louis passengers held visas for entry in Cuba. It was a voyage that began in Hamburg, Germany on May 13, 1939. Passengers say they had a joyous cruise away from the terror filled with thoughts of a new future. After 2 weeks at sea, they arrived in Havana, Cuba, but almost all of them were refused entry. After about a week of waiting, the St. Louis set sail again, hoping the U.S. would accept them. Off the coast of Miami Beach, in view of those palm trees, they were again denied. Professor Alan Lichtman is writing a book on the era called FDR and the Jews.
You can't judge historical figures from what we know today. They did not know that these countries would be overrun by Hitler, who would then be applying to these countries his horrific final solution for Jews.
With no place to dock, the ship headed back to Europe. Philip Freund was one of the passengers. He said some of them talked about a mass suicide by jumping overboard.
At least in the sea, they would die quickly, but in a concentration camp, they would be tortured, they would be humiliated, and they didn't want to go through that.
The St. Louis was eventually cleared to dock in Antwerp, Belgium. The passengers were sent to France, England, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Some historians say FDR played a crucial role here.
Roosevelt and his cabinet worked to try to find places of settlement for these people, and they succeeded.
Some of them eventually settled in the U.S. What really happened will forever be subject of interpretation and disagreement. But on this day, the passengers of the St. Louis were together again near the same sand and palm trees that once gave them hope and disappointment. Very nice story. Very nice story. 70th anniversary. Okay, now time for some of your feedback. Some of you.
Robert, the floor is yours if you can unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you, Tali. And let's see here. And thank you to the South African Genocide Foundation, the UN, HCR, the Ghetto Fighters House Museum, and the Center for Humanistic Education. We feel very privileged to be here today and to bring our St. Louis program to commemorate World Refugee Day. In his remarks last year, Mr. Leonard Zulu spoke about the resilience, strength, and fortitude of refugees. The surviving passengers of the St. Louis refugee ship, who will be sharing their stories with you, are an outstanding example of the refugees' ability to overcome insurmountable obstacles and then go on to make extraordinary contributions to society in all fields of human endeavor, including science, medicine, law, religion, education, social, and communal work. We shall hear from our distinguished guests momentarily. However, before I do introduce them, I want to discuss how the Saga of the St. Louis became a great propaganda victory for Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime, and what universal lessons can be drawn from this event that took place in the spring of 1939. As was said, the St. Louis left Hamburg, Germany on May 13, 1939. The 937 passengers were bound for Havana, Cuba. Once arriving in Havana Harbor, they were ultimately denied safe haven by the Cuban authorities. The captain steered the ship to the coastline of Miami, Florida, and together with the passengers, they pleaded with the US government to be granted safe haven. Their desperate pleas were denied. They contacted the government of Canada and made last-ditch efforts to the countries in Latin America. The response was the same: we will not take you. The St. Louis was forced to return to Europe, where on June 17, 1939, the ship docked in Antwerp, Belgium, exactly 82 years ago today. The drama of the St. Louis played out before the world. It was reported in virtually every newspaper in the United States and throughout the world, and reinforced Hitler's claim that no one wanted the Jews because they were an inferior race, they were an untrustworthy people, they were criminals and spies, they would bring misery and misfortune to the inhabitants of the land. In short, all of the propaganda used by Hitler to further the aims of the final solution. Thus, the Saga of the St. Louis symbolizes, in many ways, the world's indifference and hostility against the Jews during the pre-war and wartime period. And this story's place in history should be a lesson to all of us, Jews and non-Jews alike. What can we learn from this eventful moment in history? Most importantly, that the demonization and dehumanization of refugees, wherever they may be, can have the most catastrophic consequences, whether because of superstition, racial hatred, nationalism, lack of compassion, the mistreatment and the denial of basic human rights to refugees brings untold misery. The German word for Jews was Untermenschen, subhuman. Let us hope that on World Refugee Day 2021, we shall be reminded of our sacred duty as human beings to act in the most humane way. With that in mind, it is my great pleasure to begin the introduction of our distinguished guests, who will share their stories as refugees and what meaning it has for them and how it impacted their life. So today, Tali read the brief background. So I would like to first introduce Sonja Geismar and share with us her story and experience. Sonja?
Sonja, please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you
Yes.
see me?
Yes.
You can see me? I can't see myself. Okay, I'm so sorry about this. But you can hear me, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. This is the first line of Warsonshire's poem, Conversations About Home. In my case, the shark was Nazi Germany, which by federal, state, and local legislation imposed political, economic, and social restrictions on Jews to make it untenable to continue living in the country that had been their home for generations. Kristallnacht took place on November 9th to 10th, 1938, starting with incarcerating Jewish male adults, a rampage of setting fire to synagogues, and invading and terrorizing Jewish homes. As a 3-year-old child, I remember Nazis invading our home, throwing contents of drawers on the floor, breaking dishes and crystal, and destroying my parents' down quilts, sending down all over the room. When I saw a torn photo of my father, who was taken away that morning, I thought he had died. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, made it crystal clear that Jews were in the mouth of the shark. After 5 weeks of mistreatment and starvation in Dachau, my father was released on condition he leave Germany as soon as possible. In the frantic rush to leave Germany, my parents, grandparents, and 2 great aunts found passage on the St. Louis to Cuba, our supposed safe haven until our visas to the United States were approved and our quota numbers would be called to enter. Unbeknownst to us, the regulations to enter Cuba were changed. Our purchased landing permits were rescinded. Now, visas authorized by the Secretary of Labor and State, plus a $500 bond per passenger, were necessary to enter the country. Denied entry and ordered out of Cuban waters, Captain Gustav Schroeder sought refuge from the United States. We were so close to the coast of Florida that we could see the palm trees and beaches. Both the US and Canada denied entry. The ship was ordered to return to Germany. The desperation and anguish of the passengers was so intense that the captain created a suicide watch patrol. My father joined the committee, and the captain was thoughtful enough to write letters of gratitude to its members. The letter, treasured by my parents, is now displayed in my home. Captain Schroeder was a moral and righteous Christian and was honored posthumously by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations. Fortunately, the Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, which is still in existence today, negotiated agreements with Belgium, Netherlands, France, and Great Britain to accept the passengers so that we would not have to return to Germany, never to be heard from again. My family, as I said, a group of 7, was fortunate to be assigned to disembark in Great Britain. World War II broke out just a few months later, and the Germans soon overran their Western neighbors. The Quaker Society housed us with Mr. and Mrs. Lee in London, where my mother became the chef for the boarders. Mrs. Lee taught me my first English nursery rhyme, Baba Black Sheep. After 8 months, the JDC informed us that we could emigrate to the United States. Escorted by a convoy, we arrived safely in New York City on February 11th, 1940, a few days before my 5th birthday. I can only imagine the uncertainty and apprehension mixed with relief for being safe that my parents faced being immigrants. We lived in a 5-story walk-up building of 20 apartments. My grandparents and an uncle lived with us. My mother, who had household help in Germany, worked as a domestic for a short time until her English improved. Then she worked in a factory and subsequently as an office worker until my sister was born. My father, who owned a business in Germany, started off as a night watchman, then became a fuller brush salesman, which the fuller brush salesman went door to door to sell their wares. I think the company is still in existence today. I don't know if it's an international company, but eventually he started his own business as a personal shopper. My grandparents took care of me while my parents worked. As a young child, I wasn't aware of the difficulties and obstacles my parents had to deal with in building a new life. I didn't feel deprived or that we were poor, although we were. There was food on the table and I felt secure. I had a few outfits for school and another one for Saturdays. My mother believed in the quality of clothes rather than the quantity. My first grade teacher gave me lovely hand-me-down clothes from her daughters. I remember my parents' unattractive bedroom furniture provided by Hayas, which is still doing a good job today throughout the world. This furniture was in sharp contrast to their former furnishings, but within a few years, that bedroom set was replaced and a credenza designed to fit our small living room was purchased. We still have both of these furnishings. I felt quite alone in my first years in New York. I remember being asked by friends how I could be German and Jewish. We lived in a Bronx neighborhood with relatively few refugees, and I didn't have a refugee friend until I was about 13 years old. Most of my relatives lived in Washington Heights in Manhattan. Their neighborhood was referred to as Frankfurt on the Hudson. Washington Heights is now home to the next wave of immigrants from the Dominican Republic and is the subject of a Broadway hit and motion picture titled, fittingly, In the Heights. By the time I was 13, I felt accepted. I had friends, belonged to clubs, loved school, and graduated from Hebrew school. Friends who came to my home still remember my mother's hospitality and delicious cake. On Shabbat and holiday dinners, our Shabbat and holiday dinners were lively with invited relatives. Conversations centered on life before the war, Hitler and associates, and the progress of the war. My father brought home 2 daily newspapers. I learned world geography, history, and current events, and wanted to learn more. This interest influenced my decision to become a high school social studies teacher and later a librarian. After suffering 2 strokes, my father suddenly passed away at the early age of 52. The stress of leaving everything behind and starting at rock bottom weighed heavily on him. My mother was grief-stricken for a long time, but emerged as a strong woman who became the matriarch of the family, warm, loving, wise, elegant, and respected. She and her siblings also carried the burden of losing their parents in Auschwitz. The loss was particularly painful as my maternal grandparents were supposed to leave Germany immediately after we emigrated, but were rounded up and sent to a camp in Gurs in France. They were caught in a maze of bureaucratic paper walls that prevented them both from emigrating and immigrating. A recently published book entitled The Unwanted: America, Auschwitz, and a Village Caught in Between reveals the story of their and the family's 2-year ordeal of hope and despair, and hope and despair. My parents made so many sacrifices to rise to the middle class. They supported my desire to attend college. After my father died, my mother took over his business and insisted that I continue my education. My parents created a loving and comfortable home for us. In turn, My husband, who was also a German refugee, and I were influenced to be proud Jews, true to our religion, and taught our two devoted children to be faithful. I'm also grateful to have 5 loving grandchildren, 3 in Israel and 2 in New York. My extended refugee family lives or lived in the United States, Israel, Great Britain, Australia, Uruguay, Shanghai, and yes, South Africa. We have had 3 family reunions to keep our bond and heritage together. For the past number of years, I've given lectures in schools, colleges, community centers, and synagogues. And of course, I participate in the St. Louis Legacy Project. We were most fortunate that the mouth of a shark led us to fulfilling and good lives in the United States, where we could make contributions to the well-being of American society. Thank you for your attention. I'm sorry you couldn't see me.
Thank you very much, Sonja. And it's with great pleasure I now introduce our special guest, Eva Wiener.
Thank you, Robert. I saw you, Sonja, and you're beautiful as usual.
Oh, you could see me? I can't, I have a blank screen practically. I don't know
Okay.
what happened.
Am I visible? Yes, I can see myself as well.
Okay.
My story is very similar to Sonja's in that my parents and I were fortunate enough to go to England. My parents were married shortly after Hitler came to power, and life by that time had become very difficult. My father was one of 8 children, and they owned a very, very successful business. They owned one of the largest kosher bakeries in Berlin. He came from a very religious and observant family, and he was always an observant Jew. He always raved about the fact that he never needed to tear a piece of paper on the Sabbath in order to keep his Judaism and his beliefs and his observance alive. My father, the day after Kristallnacht, was sent to Warsaw. Because he was born in Poland, he was being sent back to the country of origin, and he was on a train with hundreds of other men being sent back to Warsaw. He found himself sharing a 1-bedroom apartment with 12 other men. But of course, that wasn't his major problem. He had left behind in Berlin his wife, my mother, and their baby, that was me, not knowing what our fate was going to be. My mother's 2 sisters and 1 brother, who had already left for Havana, Cuba, were found in Berlin, basically standing on lines for hours on end at every consulate and every embassy imaginable, begging and pleading for visas to leave the country. My mother was able to obtain a visa to Siam, now of course Thailand. Therefore, she now had evidence that she had means to leave the country. My father then was able to make his way back from Warsaw to Berlin on the condition that they leave the country immediately. But in the meantime, she had already sent money to my uncle in Cuba, asking him to purchase a visa. While my father was traveling back from Warsaw to Berlin, the papers for Cuba came. So given the choice of going to a place like Siam, which was a 3rd world country and obviously not as enticing as a place like Havana, Cuba, my mother's choice was easy to make, and she was able to book passage on the MS St. Louis. My father, when he was taken out of Berlin, had left behind 3 major businesses. We were quite well-to-do. We were very comfortable in our home and in our livelihood. My father owned a boot factory. Ironically, he was making boots for the SS and for the police. He also owned a trucking company. And he also owned one of the first registered taxi cabs in Berlin, as well as having a part ownership in the family bakery. By the time Kristallnacht had come, my father's brother, his parents, and 3 sisters were upset with what was happening, and they departed Germany and went to Palestine, before Israel, of course. The rest of the family, my father's one sister, saw the writing on the wall and decided to put her one son on a Kindertransport for England. But she decided to stay behind and run the bakery so that after all this nonsense was going to be over, and that's what she called it, nobody's going to follow this madman called Hitler, and it'll all blow over very quickly. By that time, everyone in the family will be able to come back, and she will have maintained the bakery. Sadly to say, that was not to be. She was taken to Auschwitz and perished there. One sister and her husband and the baby went to Belgium and found a safe haven there for the time being. As a matter of fact, when the ship came back to Antwerp, Belgium, my aunt, her husband, and the baby were on the dock to greet us. Unfortunately, their fate was not to be good. They also perished in Auschwitz. We were the fortunate ones. Of all the 4 countries, we were permitted to go to England. I did not, unfortunately, be able to leave England before the war was over. So we did not leave England until 1946. My parents decided, rather than go to Palestine to my father's family, because Palestine was also in a state of flux and not yet Israel, not yet having won its independence. And my mother's 2 sisters, fortunately, had been able to get passage to the United States. So my mother won the discussion. We decided, or they decided, to come to America. We arrived in America on a holiday weekend, Memorial Day weekend, at the end of May. Unfortunately, as was often the case, there was a dock strike, and we weren't able to disembark in New York. It was frightening for my parents, remembering what happened to us in harbor of Havana. But fortunately, the strike was over, and after the weekend, we were permitted to disembark. And we settled in Queens, New York, but spent much time in a place called Belmar, New Jersey, a lovely seaside resort. I later married a man from Belmar, New Jersey, and have since lived my life in or at the Jersey Shore. I did work as a bookkeeper for many years, and then took a position for the American Department of Defense as a budget analyst. And I felt that I was serving the country that finally decided I was not going to harm the United States, but welcomed me in 1946. I am living at the Jersey Shore to my wonderful husband and my two wonderful daughters and two incredible grandchildren. And I'm grateful for the difference of laws that permitted me to enter America in 46 that denied me entry in 39. I am grateful for having had opportunity here in America. But the story of my parents' immigration to not only England, but to America as well, was extremely traumatic. In England, my parents knew no English. It took quite a while for them to be acclimated. I did not speak English until I was 5 years old, until I was enrolled in public school in England. My language at home was German and Yiddish. And my friends, since we lived in a immigration community, even talking to my friends was in German and Yiddish. Coming to America was another awakening. My father was an extremely ambitious and hardworking man. He decided, after working as a baker for a while, and then not being able to be Sabbath observant in doing that, he started his own delivery business or trucking, just using one little truck and one man at the wheel, built a very nice, comfortable trucking business. Immigration was difficult, uprooting us from Germany, England, and then to the US, had its toll on my parents. Now, I am fortunate in the fact that I was only 10 months old when we boarded the ship. And of course, I do not have any conscious recollection. But my parents were very, very sharing. And I knew about the trip. I knew all about the traumas that they experienced. They shared that. And I was not even aware of the significance of the ship until I was not only an adult, but married, when the story of the St. Louis finally came to light. How this ship would become a symbol of what the Nazi Party was going to do to eliminate unwanted cargo of Jewish passengers and eliminate the Jewish people. But of course, we know it didn't remain only with Jews. It went on to pick on and destroy other cultures, other religions, anyone that was different. And when I speak to children, and I do all the time, I explain that this was always a product of the festering of hate, bigotry, prejudice, anti-Semitism, if allowed to grow, can become another Holocaust. And we haven't learned our lesson because genocides are still happening today. And I encourage the children to stand up against any injustice and speak up when one sees an injustice happening. And we survivors are not going to be here much longer by virtue of our age. And I encourage them, I even assign them a homework assignment that in their future, They must continue telling our story and the stories of all Holocaust survivors to prevent it from ever happening again. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. It is with my great pleasure to introduce our final guest, Thomas Jacobson. I want to make one comment. You know, in the United States, we've endured the George Floyd incident, which has caused so much turmoil. So I want to comment about Thomas Jacobson and his leadership in the civil rights movement, I suppose 60 years ago, as a very important life lesson, and we're most happy to have him here today. So Thomas, please share with us your story and experience.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be with all of you here during this very important event that's being celebrated. My experience is very similar to the other passengers. I was only a year old when St. Louis went on its perilous journey to try to get into Cuba, and I have no memory of the voyage itself. Getting to the point where we actually left in 1939, my family, my grandfather owned a department store in Insterburg. He was very well off. He'd served in the German army during World War I. He was a person that believed in assimilation. He felt he was really probably more German than Jewish. And it was in that environment that we grew up. In 1935, when the Nuremberg laws were enacted, my parents knew what the handwriting on the wall was going to be, and they made their application for quota and getting a visa into the United States. But our number didn't come up until November of 1939. So we weren't able to get into the US and get out of Germany. So 1938, when Kristallnacht happened, again, my father was put in a concentration camp in Dachau. It was a very, very traumatic experience for him as well as for my mother. Once he was in Dachau, I was a year old. Well, not even, I was 6 months old, and then I have a brother that was 5. She had to figure out what happened to my father, and she went to the SS and determined that at that time what they were doing was they were justifying the arrest of all the Jews as being for their own protection. So she was told basically in order for him to get out of Dachau, then we would have to show proof that we were going to get out of the country. At that time, Hitler's policies were kind of in conflict with one another. He wanted desperately to get rid of the Jews, but at the same time, he enacted laws that fleeced the Jews out of all their money if they were going to leave the country. When we left, we only had 10 marks. That was like less than $10. That's all. Everything else was taken by the German government. So when we left, we ended up in Holland. We were in High Plaat, and then when our number came up, we went to Westerbork, and from Westerbork, we left and went to the US. We got here in 1940. Again, we were very fortunate. I mean, number one, to get out of Germany in the first place, and number two, getting out of Holland before May 1 when Hitler invaded, and then all the Jews that were still at Westerbork where we were, they were sent back to the gas chambers in the east. My experience in the US, again, very similar to what Eva and Sonja were talking about. It was very difficult for my family. We had no money. We were really at the mercy of our sponsors. They had a factory. That's where my father, who couldn't speak English, he originally started working in the factory until he learned English, and then he went back into what his real occupation was in sales. He started working at Penny's in Milwaukee, and then Milwaukee is where I grew up. I'm in Los Angeles now, but I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee was the most hyper-segregated city in the United States at that time. There was just terrible conditions for the Black community. As far as our family was concerned, when my father went to Penny's, he was fired as soon as they found out he was a Jew. That's even in the United States that kind of thing was happening. Then he went to work at Sears, and he eventually went back to Penny's. He became the top salesman in the United States in the Penny chain. And on the most busiest day of the year in sales in department stores, the day after Thanksgiving, he had a stroke and he died. He was 50 years old. So at that time I was 12, my brother was 17. My mother, she really was the rock in the family, just as she had been in Germany. After my father was in Dachau, he was a basket case, and she really had to take over taking care of the decisions that had to be made for our family. She worked in the United States, very difficult. She had money in Germany, very wealthy family. She had nothing in the United States. She ended up having to work. That's very difficult when you come from money and you end up with nothing. She worked in sales. She had her own business, Fashions, during the war, where she made clothes for youngsters. And after the war, she continued working. I started working when I was 13. I worked as a janitor's assistant. I worked as a garbage collector in the village that I lived. During the summers, I worked on a farm. Basically, my brother was a cab driver. He sold papers on a newspaper corner, and he ended up being a dentist. I ended up being a lawyer. I went to the Madison, Wisconsin to get my degree in law. That's where I really learned about human rights issues, because Madison is a hotbed of radical activity for young students that want to fight to make the world a better place to live. And there were lots of action going on in Madison against injustices that were prevalent in our country at that time. I became actually the head of our civil rights organization at the University of Madison, and I led several demonstrations. One was I was asked by the head of the NAACP to work on Wisconsin having terrible, terrible discrimination problems in housing against African Americans and Jews. You know, we still had restrictive covenants at that time that restricted where you could live, wouldn't sell to Jews, wouldn't let Jews in country clubs. It was very difficult to really make it across the board if you were a Jew, or if you're Black, or if you were Hispanic, if you were anything other than a white Christian. So the struggles we did in Madison were basically, we took over the state capitol in a sense. What we did was we walked in with folding chairs, sat in front of 16 pillars, and wouldn't leave the Capitol until fair housing bill was enacted, that people tried to vote on it. When it was finally voted on, it was voted on with one Black and every white being against having fair housing in the state of Wisconsin, and that was in 1960. Later, I was asked by George Mossey, whose father in Germany was head of a large newspaper. He was anti-Hitler right from the beginning. And he was really on Hitler's target list for somebody that had to be wiped out. Mossy was head of the history department at the University of Wisconsin. A swastika was painted on the pier of a Jewish sorority. And he wanted me to investigate and find out who did it, which was a fraternity next door. The university wouldn't do anything about punishing the fraternity because we didn't know the names of the person that actually painted the swastika, though we knew that the fraternity did it. So there were lots of problems. We had one with in Madison where Jews and African Americans couldn't get membership in a certain club that was very important to be part of if you wanted to be part of the power structure in Madison. So we fought against that restriction. Once I became a lawyer, that would have been 1962, my first practice, I went in and started a law firm with an African American who had been the head of the NAACP in the state of Wisconsin. He and I had the first integrated law firm. In the 1960s, I represented all the hellraisers in civil rights in Wisconsin. I had Father Grappi, who was like Martin Luther King. I had Dick Gregory, who was a famous comedian in the United States. Everybody that got arrested. We had housing marches against discrimination. And I represented all the people that got arrested during the housing marches. We had a situation that involved, you mentioned in my introduction, where we went to the United States Supreme Court to have garnishment before judgment declared unconstitutional. We also went to the United States in another case where the Supreme Court ruled another law unconstitutional that involved my client that had been arrested during the housing marches, Father Grappi. So we had been twice in the US Supreme Court, and both times we were successful. In 1970, I was the Democratic candidate for Attorney General in the state of Wisconsin. I continued fighting for civil rights in the 70s. We were talking about the Floyd case. I had a case that came out in 1958 where a Black man was shot in the back of the head by the police in a chase. And they, in order to cover up the shooting and to lie about the circumstances of how they killed my client, what they ended up doing was they planted a knife in his hand to say that it was self-defense. There was a grand jury, the inquest, they covered it all up. They lied about what actually happened. 20 years later, one of the police officers involved in the killing told the truth that they had planted a knife. And we were successful in having a lawsuit brought against the city and the police department and the district attorney's office for the way he handled that case. And we won. There was an award of $2 million that was sustained by the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And I never did have to go to the US Supreme Court. So my struggles for human rights and for decency, for how people should be treated, it all was because of the experiences I had on the St. Louis and how the Jews were treated. The lesson of the St. Louis, it's just like what Gable said. And that was the lesson of the St. Louis, that there was a green light to exterminate the Jews. Nobody wanted them. There was no country that we could go to. We were denied in Canada. We were denied in Cuba. We were denied in the US. All of us that are survivors, thank God that we were spared and that we were given the opportunity to continue our lives and to make contributions to make a difference. I think everybody on the St. Louis came away with the understanding we could never allow such a thing to happen again, that you have to fight against it. that you have to struggle, that you have to never allow it to happen in your community. We've just gone through in this country, in the US, in my opinion, 4 years of total hell with the president that we had for those 4 years against immigration, first and foremost. We can't allow that kind of attitude to sink in. Look what happened in January 6th in this country. We had an insurrection to take over the state capitol of the United States by supporters of the president, the ex-president. And now we have a party, we have a two-party system here, Republicans and Democrats, and the Republicans in this country have taken, they won't allow a commission to investigate what happened on January 6th, and they're trying to destroy the right to vote for people. Democracy is imperiled by what's happening in this country. We have to continue to fight, struggle, and speak out to make sure that these injustices don't continue and cannot happen again. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Tali, I believe
Yes.
your time.
Yes, thank you. Du, it's to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tali. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Sonja. Thank you, Eva. And thank you, Thomas. And thank you, Noha, as well. At this time, it is my pleasure to present Mary Kluk. Mary Kluk is the director of the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center and also the national president of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies. And Mary will speak to us, but also will open the session to address the questions that many of you have and perhaps the comments that many of you have. And before I hand over to Mary, I'd just like to invite people to begin posting your questions and your comments on the chat. So Mary Kluk is an old friend, so it's a pleasure to see Mary again. So over to you, Mary.
Thanks, Mdu, and thank you to everybody, particularly our partners. Wonderful session and very thought-provoking speakers. Thank you to our speakers, to Robert Krakow. I've been to webinars with you before, and your commitment to this history of the St. Louis and is absolutely inspiring. Thank you so much for the work that you do at your foundation to make sure that governments are held to account even today, or the attempt to hold governments to account is not lost in the endeavors that you pursue. I particularly wanted to thank Sonja, Eva, and Thomas for their extraordinarily poignant testimonies. But not only were they poignant, they were so inspiring. I found it personally extraordinary that people who have overcome, insurmountable obstacles, your families went through so much, and yet each one of your testimonies was filled with so much gratitude for what you have today and what you've been able to overcome and how you've been able to make such significant contributions to your society and to the upliftment of human rights. And in Thomas's words, to being an upstander. As we in the education programs at our 3 centers, the essence of our work is to encourage young people to stand up and to speak out against injustice. As we know, on this World Refugee Weekend, World Refugee Day weekend, which is on Sunday, the 20th of June, refugees are experiencing untold misery. And to quote the UNHCR, it's our sacred duty as human beings to act in a humane way. I would like to just refer to Romeo Dallaire, who spoke in referencing the tragic genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda. All humans are human. No humans are more human than others. I do want to refer to the chat, but I'm very conscious that we are at 8:30, an hour and a half, and so the program is going to have very little time to address all the questions. But I do want to refer to the substantial comments around how mankind has a short memory and how we need to not make the same mistakes. Arvind Gupta is saying the bane of mankind is its short-term memory. And he goes on to say, I do hope the words of our speakers really sink deeper into the very being of every human being and that true changes are effected. I salute the survivors of the enormous tragedy that was the Holocaust. And there are many other comments referring, Linda Jimenez Glassman refers to the same thing, where how will we stand up and speak against prejudice and injustice? How will we have the courage to make sure that this doesn't happen again? Teach your children, teach all children, says Rob. So, and I would just like to say that if there are any other questions, I do encourage people to put them in the chat because we are short of time. But I think I'll speak for all of us when I say that this evening has been inspiring. Survivor testimonies are always inspiring, but somehow this evening, your unique, candid way of referring to a really difficult time in your lives when you were infants, and yet the long-term impact of those experiences on your families was deeply meaningful. Thank you so much. Is there any? There are some comments. There are a few other points. I'm interested to know what the guest speakers think of the book, The German Girl by Armando Lucas Correa. Thank you once again for such an inspiring and thought-provoking evening. Thank you all so much for attending. Philip Kravitz references the establishment of the State of Israel. And I think I would just like to ask if Robert would close by addressing the question or the point made by Ori Salters. Thank you for reintroducing the word refugee into this conversation, which has been too often replaced in the last decade by migrant, a word with very different implications. Maybe, Robert, you could close the evening for us with your thoughts on that comment, please.
Thank you. I would say that or sometimes in our Q&As after our film, I'll make the comment that President Roosevelt would be turning over in his grave had he known the implications of his decision not to accept the passengers of the St. Louis, and that the message that it sent to the Nazis and to Hitler. We didn't have time or the opportunity to go through the contributions of the passengers of the St. Louis. What you heard from these three distinguished guests can be replicated by many, many more that achieved extraordinary contributions at the highest level in science and government. So my close would be, we must be mindful of what that one life can contribute to society. We don't know that the refugees that died in the Mediterranean trying to leave Libya, or the refugees attempting to get to South Africa, we may not know what lives were lost in that treacherous journey. And we may not know, and we won't know, what these refugees might and could have contributed. What we do know is that when given a chance, the human spirit will endure, and people that experience these tragedies will overcome them and make the most marvelous lives for themselves and inspire others, as Thomas, Eva, and Sonja have done. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks.
Thank you, Robert. Maybe I'll just beg your indulgence and just ask about the impact of the apology that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton made on behalf of the American government of the day in not supporting the refugees or the passengers at that stage on the St. Louis.
Well, very quickly, I had written a play that put Roosevelt on trial. It was performed at Georgetown University, and someone from the State Department was in the audience. They liked it. They asked me about doing something as a State Department, but they had in mind a minor event. When I heard about it, I went to friends of Secretary of State Clinton, Ambassador Eisenstadt, And they thought, you know what? This is the moment we're going to hold ourselves accountable. And to Hillary, Secretary of State Clinton's everlasting credit, she understood the 70 years of stain on the State Department and the Roosevelt administration, and decided that they would accept our offer to bring 14 passengers. And it serves as a distinctive moment in American Jewish and Holocaust history. The impact, I think, had a great impact on many of those who then become aware of it. And I think it had an impact on the Canadian government and inspired Trudeau to make his very, very thoughtful, sincere apology, which is we've seen in our film and has struck a chord in, I think, people around the world. So you said in your remarks about accountability, you know, that our passengers, myself, and organization, you know, could have put that forward in a way and as a message that say, look, we're gonna remember, and we're gonna hold you accountable if enough of us get together to do that. So thank you for asking.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you everybody for your participation. Thank you, Mdu, for your wonderful endeavors as our master of ceremony, as always, and to the wonderful survivors for your testimony. The impact is long-lasting. It's a memory and an evening we won't forget. Thank you all so much for attending. Keep safe, keep healthy. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting us. Our pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, Eva. Thank you, Thomas. And thank you, Sonja.